She begged a millionaire to save her brother. His response shocked everyone. The night air outside St. Mary's Hospital was heavy with rain. But inside the emergency wing, the air was heavier still, filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic, the quick footsteps of nurses rushing between rooms, and the relentless sound of machines that reminded everyone how fragile life could be. Emily Carter sat hunched forward on a stiff bench in the waiting area, her arms tightly wrapped around the small, trembling hand of her 12-year-old brother, Daniel, who lay weak and pale on the gurney beside her, struggling to catch each shallow breath as the oxygen mask pressed against his face hissed with effort. The fluorescent lights above them flickered unsteadily, casting shadows across the tiled floor, making everything feel more uncertain, more unstable, as if even the hospital itself could not hold steady under the weight of what was happening. Emily's heart pounded in her chest so loudly that she could barely hear the rapid beeping of the monitors attached to Daniel's body, but every time she looked at those jagged lines on the screen, her throat tightened with panic, terrified that the next moment those lines might flatten, that the sound might stop, that the world might collapse around her. She kept whispering her brother's name, brushing his damp forehead, her voice breaking with each syllable, as if just saying his name could anchor him to this world a little longer. Daniel's lips quivered, his eyes opening only for seconds at a time, his small hand gripping hers with whatever strength remained, and though he could not form words, his frightened gaze begged her not to let him go. Then the door to the examination room swung open, and the attending physician, a tall man with tired eyes and a clipboard clutched in his hand, stepped forward with the look of someone who had delivered. News like this too many times before, but never found it any easier. His voice was steady yet heavy, each word carrying a weight that seemed to press directly onto Emily's chest. "Emily, Daniel needs emergency surgery," he said, pausing as if choosing the least devastating words he could. But even the pause sent her stomach twisting. "Without it, he won't make it through the night." The sentence shattered the air between them, and Emily felt as though the ground had fallen away beneath her, leaving her clinging to nothing. The doctor's voice continued, explaining that the surgery was urgent, the only option, the only lifeline her brother had. But it came with a price, an unthinkable price. "The operation will cost $150,000. For a brief second, Emily stared at him blankly, her mind unable to grasp the number, as if her brain refused to process it, as if the digits themselves were too large, too cruel, to exist in her reality. Then it struck her like a thunderclap, and her lips parted as though she might argue, as though she might say she could manage it somehow, but the truth suffocated her before she could even form a protest. She had nothing. She had no savings, no family to turn to, no hidden treasure waiting for her in some bank account. She worked shifts at a small diner on the corner of 5th and Main, barely scraping together enough tips to keep the lights on in the small apartment they shared, and often she had gone without meals so Daniel could eat. $150,000 might as well have been 150 million. Her entire body went cold as the reality set in. There was no way, no path, no miracle she could summon from her own strength. The doctor's words lingered in the sterile air, and then he quietly excused himself to prepare papers, leaving Emily alone with the impossible. She turned her face toward her brother, her tears falling faster now, dripping onto his fragile hand, and in that moment she realized how powerless she truly was. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold, hard floor, the chills seeping through her thin jeans, but she barely felt it over the ache ripping through her chest. Clutching her trembling hands together, as though they might form a shield against the darkness closing in, she lifted her tear-streaked face toward the ceiling lights that buzzed and flickered above. "Please, God," she whispered, her voice breaking apart. "Please, send me a miracle." The words escaped not just as a plea, but as a desperate cry from the deepest part of her soul, a cry that seemed to echo in the sterile corridors, bouncing off the walls, carrying her pain into every corner of that hospital. Around her, the world carried on. Nurses continued their urgent tasks. Doctors shouted for equipment. Stretchers rolled down the hallway. But to Emily, it all blurred into background noise, because in that single moment, her entire world had narrowed to one truth. Her brother's life was slipping away, and all she had left was her faith that somewhere, somehow, something greater than her might hear her prayer. The echo of Emily's desperate prayer still lingered in the sterile air of St. Mary's when the quiet hum of hospital life was suddenly broken by a surge of activity near the private wing, where flashes from cameras burst like lightning against the polished glass doors. Nurses paused mid-stride, orderlies whispered, and even patients in wheelchairs craned their necks to see the commotion. Whispers spread like fire. Alexander Grant had arrived, the billionaire tech mogul, the man whose face appeared on magazine covers and television screens, the man whose empire had turned him into the wealthiest and perhaps most feared figure in the city, was walking into the hospital for a routine checkup. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit despite the late hour, his presence filling the lobby like a storm cloud, cold, powerful, untouchable. His reputation had preceded him long before his arrival. Everyone knew Alexander Grant was brilliant in business, merciless in negotiations, and utterly unmoved by human emotion. To many, he was a figure to be admired from a distance, but to those who had tried to seek compassion from him, he was nothing more than an unscalable wall of ice. Emily, still kneeling on the floor outside the ICU with her brother fighting for life behind closed doors, heard the murmur of his name ripple through the hall. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with both fear and hope. Alexander Grant, the richest man in the city, was right here, within reach, not in some office tower high above the streets, but in the same building, only steps away. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she caught sight of him walking across the gleaming lobby, trailed by his bodyguards and hospital staff. This could be it. This could be the miracle she had begged for. Without hesitation, she pushed past startled visitors and startled nurses, her tears still streaking down her cheeks, and ran straight toward the billionaire before security could stop her. She fell to her knees directly in front of him, ignoring the startled gasps of onlookers, her hands pressed together, her body shaking with desperation. Her voice cracked, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Mr. Grant, please. My brother is dying. The doctor said only surgery can save him, but I can't afford it. You have the money. I beg you, help me." The cameras, which had been poised to capture polished images of the city's wealthiest man, now turned toward the scene unfolding at his feet. Photographers froze, unsure whether to keep snapping or to put their lenses down, while murmurs of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Alexander, however, did not flinch. His piercing grey eyes moved down to Toman, the trembling girl on the floor, his expression flat, unreadable. The corners of his lips set in a straight line that betrayed no empathy, no recognition of her pain. For a heartbeat, Emily thought she saw his eyes soften, but then his voice cut through the heavy silence, cold and sharp like a blade. "Do you know how many people try to use tears to get to me?" he said, each word deliberate, each syllable echoing off the marble floor, as though meant to pierce not just her, but everyone watching. "Your brother's life isn't my responsibility." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat, her body trembling harder as she reached out, clutching at his sleeve with trembling fingers, desperate to anchor him in place. "Please, please, he's only 12 years old," she sobbed, her tears falling onto the polished leather of his shoes, her voice so raw it scraped her throat. But Alexander did not look down again. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his jaw tight, his face carved in stone. One of the bodyguards stepped forward, ready to peel Emily away, but she clung harder, her knuckles white as she grabbed his hand. "Don't walk away from me," she cried, her voice echoing across the silent lobby. "You could save him. You could save him with less than what you spend on dinner." For the briefest moment, the millionaire's hand remained in hers, warm and real, a lifeline she prayed would hold. But then he pulled away, the motion swift and final, as though shaking off a raindrop. He did not glance back, did not acknowledge the whispers rising from the crowd. did not slow his stride as he headed toward the gleaming VIP elevator at the far end of the hall. The cameras resumed their clicking, but now the images they captured were not of a powerful man commanding admiration. They were of a desperate girl left crumpled on the hospital floor as the man with the means to save her walked away. Emily's body shook violently as she collapsed back onto her knees, her cries muffled by the sterile walls, her heart screaming with the knowledge that she had touched hope with her fingertips only to have it ripped from her grasp by the coldest man she had ever encountered. The sound of Emily's sobs in the lobby eventually faded into the background hum of the hospital as the hours crawled forward, each one heavier and more unbearable than the last. And though the world outside the windows of St. Mary's turned darker as night thickened, the lights in the ICU burned brighter, illuminating the frantic silhouettes of doctors and nurses fighting against the inevitable decline of Daniel's fragile body. Inside that room, the steady rhythm of machines turned into an erratic symphony of alarms, shrill beeps spiking unpredictably, red warning lights flashing on monitors as physicians barked orders for more medication, for more oxygen, for someone to page the surgeon again, while a nurse pressed firm hands against the boy's chest, watching the jagged lines on the screen stutter and dip dangerously low. Just beyond those closed doors, Emily sat hunched in a hard plastic chair, her hands trembling violently as they covered her face, her hair falling forward in tangled strands damp with tears. She rocked gently back and forth, whispering prayers she no longer knew how to form into coherent sentences. The cruel image of Alexander's face, stone cold, dismissive, walking away, looping endlessly in her mind like a cruel film reel she could not shut off. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him turning from her, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble as though her pleas had meant nothing, and each replay of that memory stabbed deeper, until she felt as though she was bleeding on the inside, bleeding from wounds no one else could see. Down the hall, the shriek of another alarm made her flinch violently, her head snapping up as though she could will herself through the walls and into Daniel's room, as though her sheer desperation might somehow help him breathe, but she was not allowed in, and so she sat in the sterile hallway, powerless, time itself torturing her with its relentless pace, every second another reminder that her brother was slipping away. Far above the ICU, in the private luxury suite, tucked into the hospital's top floor, Alexander Grant poured himself a glass of aged scotch, the amber liquid catching the dim light like liquid fire. He sat in silence, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, but the echo of Emily's cry lingered in his mind, louder than he cared to admit. He lifted the glass slowly, the crystal cool against his fingertips, and brought it toward his lips, but just as the alcohol's smoky scent reached him, something in his chest tightened. His breath caught, his body freezing mid-motion, the room around him dissolving as a memory he had buried long ago tore itself free, crashing through his carefully built walls of indifference. He was no longer Alexander Grant, billionaire mogul. He was a boy again, small and frightened, standing in a hospital eerily similar to this one, his hand clutching the thin fingers of his mother, her face pale and strained as she gasped for air. He remembered the way she had begged the doctors, her voice breaking as she pleaded for treatment, the way they had glanced at her with pity before shaking their heads, explaining that without insurance, without money, nothing could be done. He remembered watching her cry in a hallway, much like the one Emily now sat in, remembered how she had collapsed when she realized no miracle would come for her, remembered how her breathing had slowed, faltered, and then stopped, leaving him standing in silence, numb and broken, with no one in the world to hold him. The glass in Alexander's hand began to tremble, the surface of the scotch rippling like a disturbed pond, and with a sharp intake of breath, he set it down on the polished table before it could slip from his grip. His reflection in the glass caught his eye, an older version of the boy who had once known desperation firsthand, now staring back at him with the same hollow emptiness he had once cursed in others. His jaw tightened, his chest heavy as he muttered under his breath, barely louder than the hum of the ventilation system. Am I becoming the same heartless men who once ignored me? The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating, the silence around him deepening as though the walls themselves demanded an answer. Downstairs in the ICU corridor, time seemed to fracture as chaos erupted. The steady beeping of Daniel's monitor suddenly spiked into frantic alarms, shrill and merciless, filling the sterile air like sirens of doom. Nurses rushed past with trays of equipment, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor, voices rising in urgent commands as one shouted for more oxygen and another called for the crash cart. Emily leapt from her chair, her hands pressed against the glass window of Daniel's room, her eyes wide with horror as she watched her little brother's chest heave in uneven gasps, his frail body trembling under the assault of failing lungs. Her own scream stuck in her throat, strangled by terror as she banged against the door, begging them to let her in, begging God not to take him away. Every second stretched like an eternity, every alarm a knife twisting deeper into her chest until her knees buckled and she sank against the wall, whispering his name through broken sobs. And then, in the middle of the chaos, the ICU doors slammed open with a force that cut through the noise, and the entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. Standing framed in the doorway was Alexander Grant, his tall figure casting a long shadow beneath the harsh lights, flanked by two stone-faced bodyguards and the hospital's head surgeon at his side. Gasps rippled through the hall as staff froze mid-step, their shock at the billionaire's sudden appearance, breaking the rhythm of their frantic work. Emily's head jerked up, her tear-streaked face pale and disbelieving as her eyes locked onto the man she thought had abandoned her to despair only hours ago. Her breath caught in her throat as he strode forward with commanding steps, his voice cutting clean and sharp through the noise. "Get the best surgical team in here," he ordered, his tone unyielding, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. He pulled a sleek black card from his wallet, pressing it firmly into the surgeon's hand. "I'll cover every expense, no matter the cost." The head surgeon's brows lifted in shock before he gave a brisk nod and rushed toward the operating room, his voice booming as he called for specialists to assemble immediately. For a moment, the world seemed to blur for Emily, her vision swimming between tears and disbelief, her mind struggling to reconcile the image before her, the man who had turned away from her pleas, now standing like a pillar of certainty in her darkest hour. Her lips trembled as she forced the words out, her voice barely more than a whisper, but heavy with both gratitude and confusion. You came back." Her knees felt weak, her hands clutched at her chest as though to keep her heart from breaking all over again, but this time for reasons she could not even begin to name. Alexander turned his head toward her, his face still stern but his eyes carrying something softer now, something long buried beneath years of ice. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady, carrying with it not only authority but an unshakable promise. "No child should suffer because of money," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable carving itself into her soul. "I won't let your brother die." In that moment, the walls seemed to fall away, the alarms and chaos fading into the background as Emily stared at him, her breath trembling in her chest, her heart unable to comprehend the shift that had taken place. Around them, nurses scrambled, doctors prepped surgical trays, and orderlies wheeled Daniel's bed toward the operating wing. But for Emily, the only sound that mattered was Alexander's vow. The only sight that mattered was his unwavering presence as he stood not as a distant billionaire, not as the cold man who once walked away, but as the unexpected savior who had returned when hope was nearly extinguished. The sterile double doors of the operating theater swung closed behind Daniel's bed, leaving Emily and Alexander standing in the starkly lit corridor with nothing but the sound of hurried footsteps fading into the distance. And in that instant, the weight of helplessness fell upon them both like a suffocating blanket. The walls seemed too close, the air too thin, as Emily paced back and forth, her fingers twisting together until her knuckles turned white, her lips moving in silent prayers she barely had the strength to form anymore. Alexander stood stiffly at her side, his tall frame unyielding yet restless, his eyes darting to the glowing red sign above the operating room door that read, "Surgery in progress," as though staring at it hard enough might somehow shorten the endless hours ahead. Inside the theatre, the muffled echoes of surgeons' voices, the clatter of instruments, and the beeping of machines seeped faintly through the door, each sound a haunting reminder that Daniel's fragile body was now caught in the delicate balance between life and death. Emily pressed her ear against the cold metal for a moment, desperate to hear something, anything, but the indistinct sounds only made her chest tighten further. She slid down against the wall, hugging her knees, tears spilling freely as she whispered, "Please, God, let him come back to me." The minutes stretched into hours, each second dragging on like a lifetime, and though Alexander had found Ashed boardroom battles, billion-dollar deals, and crises that had brought nations to their knees, never had time itself mocked him in such cruel silence. He tried to distract himself by pacing, by pulling out his phone only to set it back down, by adjusting his cufflinks as though any act of control could matter here. But his composure cracked with every muffled alarm, every frantic shout that leaked from behind the doors. Emily's sobs punctuated the silence, raw and jagged, and though Alexander's instinct was to remain detached, to keep the armor of indifference that had protected him for years, something within him shifted each time her voice broke. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, but the truth was, he didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him until his chest ached. At one point, a nurse hurried past, pushing a tray of fresh instruments, her face pale with urgency, and Emily lunged forward, grabbing her sleeve, begging for news. The nurse's eyes softened, but she shook her head, whispering, "They're still fighting for him," before disappearing inside. Emily collapsed again, her head buried in her hands, and Alexander, against his nature, lowered himself to sit beside her, their shoulders brushing, the distance between them shrinking not by choice but by shared desperation. Neither spoke, but their silence was louder than words, a fragile bond forged by the unbearable weight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity stretched beyond reason, the doors swung open, and the chief surgeon stepped out, his scrubs stained, his mask dangling around his neck, sweat plastering strands of hair to his forehead. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her entire body trembling as she staggered to her feet, terrified of what his face might reveal. For a heartbeat, the surgeon's expression remained unreadable, and the world seemed to hold still, the corridor frozen in suspended silence. Then, slowly, his lips curved into a tired but genuine smile. "The surgery was successful," he said, his voice carrying the weight of relief, exhaustion, and triumph all at once. "Daniel is going to live." Emily's knees buckled, her entire body collapsing under the force of joy as sobs burst from her chest, louder and rawer than any she had cried before. But this time they were not cries of despair. They were cries of salvation. She stumbled forward, clutching Alexander's arm with both hands, burying her tear-soaked face against the fabric of his suit as though he were the only anchor left in a storm that had nearly destroyed her. "You didn't just save him," she sobbed, her words muffled but drenched in sincerity. "You saved me too." Alexander stood rigid at first, his instinct to remain detached warring with the unfamiliar warmth surging through his chest. But then his body softened, his arm steadying her as something long forgotten stirred within him. For the first time in years he felt his chest tighten, not from pride, not from power, not from the cold satisfaction of victory, but from something far more fragile, something he thought had been buried forever: compassion. And as Emily clung to him, her tears soaking through, Alexander's own eyes burned, though he blinked hard against the sting, unprepared for the flood of emotion that threatened to break through the armor he had spent a lifetime building. The sterile brightness of the hospital slowly gave way to softer days, filled with hope, as Daniel's fragile body began to heal, and after long nights of anxious vigil, the moment finally came when his eyelids fluttered open, revealing tired but gentle eyes that found his sister's face beside him. Emily gasped, tears spilling instantly as she leaned close, clutching his frail hand with both of hers, whispering his name as though speaking it might keep him tethered to life itself. "You're safe now, Daniel," she whispered over and over, her words tumbling out in shaky breaths, each one a prayer of grace. Attitude, each syllable drenched in relief. Daniel's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, his voice weak but filled with the kind of innocence that pierced straight through the heart. "I knew you wouldn't let me go." Emily's sobs came harder, her forehead pressed to his hand as she whispered thanks to God, to fate, and silently to the man who had made the impossible possible. Just beyond the doorway, Alexander stood, silent and unmoving, his tall figure framed in the threshold like a sentinel who had guarded from the shadows. He didn't step inside, not wanting to intrude on the purity of that reunion, but his eyes softened as he watched the siblings cling to one another, their bond stronger than the machines, the doctors, or even his wealth could ever replicate. For years, his name had carried power, influence, and fear. But in that quiet moment it meant nothing compared to the peace rising unexpectedly in his chest, a calm he had not felt since boyhood, when life was simpler, when compassion had not yet been buried under fortune and pride. The city outside already buzzed with headlines, his name splashed across every paper, every news feed, hailed as a savior who had answered a desperate plea, but Alexander knew the truth. The real redemption had not been earned in flashing cameras or public praise, but in the silent shift within his own heart, a place long starved of humanity. He took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor, drawing Emily's gaze from her brother. She rose quickly, brushing at her wet cheeks, but her tears flowed anew as he finally met her eyes. There was no arrogance there now, no cold indifference, only sincerity that startled even her. His voice, calm and firm, cut gently through the stillness. "From today," he said, his tone carrying both promise and conviction, "no child in this city will be denied care because of money. I'm starting a foundation, in Daniel's name." Emily's hands flew to her mouth, her chest heaving with the weight of disbelief and gratitude all at once, her tears streaming freely, as her knees nearly gave beneath her. The words struck her deeper than she imagined possible. Not just generosity, not just kindness, but a legacy born from her brother's struggle, a gift that would ripple far beyond the walls of this hospital. She stumbled forward and clasped his hands, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you. You'll never know what this means." Alexander only nodded, the corner of his lips curving faintly, though his eyes carried the gravity of a man transformed, of one who understood that this moment was not charity, but redemption. He turned then, his coat brushing lightly against the doorframe, as he stepped into the bustling hallway where the weight of the world seemed to wait for him. Reporters surged like a tide, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, questions exploding into the air, demanding to know why, demanding to know what had changed, demanding to capture every detail of the billionaire's stunning act. Security tried to hold them back, but Alexander lifted a hand, silencing the noise with nothing but his presence. He paused, his eyes scanning the sea of faces hungry for a soundbite, for a headline, and then his voice rang out, steady, clear, and unshakably human. "Sometimes," he said, his gaze distant as though speaking as much to himself as to them, "it takes the tears of the desperate to wake up the heart of the powerful." The crowd hushed, the words cutting through the frenzy with a weight that settled over every ear and every lens, etching themselves into the moment like a truth long forgotten, but finally spoken aloud. And as he walked forward, the cameras flashing brighter than ever, Alexander felt none of the emptiness that once accompanied such attention. Instead, he carried with him the warmth of a child's smile, the memory of a sister's desperate plea, and the knowledge that for the first time in his life, his power had been used not to build empires, but to save a single beating heart, and in doing so, to finally redeem his own